Our reading this morning is an excerpt from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. The judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. Perhaps I have once again been too optimistic. Is organized religion too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world? Perhaps I must turn my faith to the inner spiritual church, the church within the church, as the true ecclesia and the hope of the world. But again, I am thankful to God that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in the struggle for freedom. They have left their secure congregations and walked the streets with us. They have gone down the highways of the South on torturous rides for freedom. Yes, they have gone to jail with us. Some have been dismissed from their churches, have lost the support of their bishops and fellow ministers, but they have acted in the faith that right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. Their witness has been the spiritual salt that has preserved the true meaning of the gospel in these troubled times. They have carved a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of disappointment. I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle, even if our motives are at present misunderstood. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's destiny. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, we were here. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. Before closing, I feel impelled to mention at one other point in your statement that has troubled me profoundly. You warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping order and preventing violence. I doubt that you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its dogs sinking their teeth into unarmed, non-violent Negroes. I doubt that you would so quickly commend the policemen if you were to observe their ugly and inhumane treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. If you were to watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls. If you were to see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys. If you were to observe them as they did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing grace together. It is true that the police have exercised a degree of discipline in handling the demonstrators. In this sense, they have conducted themselves rather non-violently in public. But for what purpose? To preserve the evil system of segregation. Over the past few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. I have tried to make clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or perhaps even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. As T.S. Eliot has said, the last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. Our sermon topic today, fighting fear, finding purpose. Good morning. I first want to thank you all for the warm welcome that I have received. Pastor Cindy Terlazzo for allowing me to be here. Pastor Carla, who is with us in spirit and maybe even online if her aunt is in need of immediate attention at the moment. I thank you all for not leaving when you found out that Pastor Carla wasn't going to be. Thanks to Shannon, Chris, Jeremy, and Jason, just for making sure that I was comfortable and had everything I needed this morning. Thank you. So as mentioned, I come to you as a member of the ELCA, a Lutheran. I also have extensive experience in AME and AME Zion congregation and formerly Unitarian worship spaces. So if I could locate my context for you, I would say that I'm centered in a denomination of love. So I would like to greet you this morning from the Church of Love. Our excerpt that I read from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, very near the beginning of the passage that I read, was the sentence, "Perhaps I have once again been too optimistic." And I have to tell you in all honesty, having to speak to people with that near so beginning of the reading, it gave me a little pause, right? As a person of faith, that sentence is not overly optimistic on the surface. As a Black woman in America, the ringing resignation in that sentence, I'm afraid, once again, I've been too optimistic. It was all too familiar for me. And as a person whose ministry, whose calling is to work for parity, equity, and justice, for me, the sentence just conjured up the echoing of co-laborers and people who do the work with me all the time. Their screams, "Enough. Once again, we tried. Once again, I was too optimistic. I'm done." Because repeatedly experiencing failure or seemingly a failure of optimism, let's just say it's a little bit less than palatable, right? And the part of our brains and our hearts, shout out to Paul Coelho and The Alchemist, our heart doesn't want to see us repeatedly hurt, so it closes in and silences itself. But the part of our brain that wants us to succeed will shout sometimes it'll shout counter narratives. And so when I got to that part, admittedly, my new friends, I could hear my inner self lamenting. Yeah, I remember this. And I remember how much I've done. I remember the countless hours I have spent counseling and consoling those who are victimized and marginalized and otherwise set aside, undervalued, devalued by communities and systems. And like you, marched and protested. We've held dying members, family members in our hands. We've held the hands of family members who had family who were dying because of inequities in the health systems in this country. We've given aid, helped those who were struggling, often through no fault of their own, given our time and our talent and our treasures. And once again, we fear that we might have been too optimistic, and the fear creeps in. Because to make matters worse, we know we're not alone. There are countless advocates, allies, and abolitionists who have done far more than I know I could ever do. And yet somehow we might find ourselves in the still of the night with that echoing phrase, perhaps I have once again been too optimistic. So I reread it. And I read it again. And I read it again. And it might be somewhere around the 6th reading that it hit me. Now, if this were an AME service, that would be the part where I say, and then I got happy. But and we say amen. Amen. All right. And feel free to do so. I'm only a little bit Lutheran. I'm a new Lu, so I'm accepting all amens. What I want to do before I get to the happy is one of the traps we fall into today is we read a letter from a Birmingham jail with today's eyes and with today's lens. And so I want to make sure maybe we can do some sociocultural geomapping, right? So let's get us in the realm of understanding of Dr. King and what that time looked like. And again, this is not for you all. You all have done the work. Somebody might watch this online years from now. It's for them. And I'd like to call to their attention that Dr. King was born in 1929. He did his undergraduate work at Morehouse College. He attended theological seminary about 2.5 hours from here in Chester. It was an integrated seminary. He was one of 6 Blacks in a class of 100. He became class president. He then went on to Boston University for his PhD. So Dr. King, going from Morehouse to Boston University, was somewhat familiar with the racial tensions and strife in the country. That the years surrounding the letter, just a couple of things for us to think about to place ourselves back in that context. Ruby Bridges is escorted by 4 armed federal marshals as she becomes the first student to enter an elementary school. It might help when we're sociolocating ourselves in that context to think about our children and our grandchildren needing to go to school with 4 armed guards. Freedom Riders were taking buses down south, and an elected official, Governor George Wallace, stood in a doorway at the University of Alabama to block 2 Black students from entering. An elected official stood at the door, not for a minute, not for an hour, but stood and in standoff until the president had to send the National Guard to allow 2 students. If you sent grandchildren or children away to college, think about having to wait with them during a standoff before they could go to class. So that's the political climate, the secular climate. Now let's get to the religious climate of the day. Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail was written in response to an open letter written by 8 white pastors. These same pastors had 3 months prior written a letter entitled An Appeal for Law and Order and Common Sense. In the midst of segregation and beatings and killing, jail, an appeal for law and order and common sense. An open letter was sent to the newspaper by the same 8 white clergymen. Their latest letter, which had some thinly veiled references to Dr. King, was entitled A Call to Unity, and asked that the activists consider negotiation. I'm sorry, it's just funny to me. Consider negotiation and maybe the courts, but don't protest. Sounds a little like BLM, right? Sounds like Black Lives Matter. And so the problem is, if we read it with today's eyes, things like order and common sense and unity make sense. Sounds right. Why not, right? But a call to order and common sense and unity that does not mean unity, parity, equity, and justice for all Well, it's illogical, it's repugnant, and it's harmful. And think about this. The only reason Dr. King knew about their letter was because somebody had to smuggle it in. It was smuggled, the newspaper article was smuggled in to Dr. King. And that's why I want you to read it, think about how we go forward in this with those eyes, not in the 2023 eyes of a post-Obama presidency, but having to have a newspaper smuggled in. And quite necessarily, it incited him to want to respond. And so while incarcerated, Dr. King began to address the harm caused by those seemingly nebulous or peaceful terms, unity and common sense. He began literally writing his response in the margins of the newspaper that was smuggled into him. When he ran out of room, a trustee, then this is an inmate who works for the prison, they're called trustees, not trustees as in church, but a trustee would sneak him scraps of paper. So in the margins and on the scraps of paper, he was writing his response. And finally, his attorney was allowed to give him a pad of paper. And he was able to complete the letter to from a Birmingham jail, which was ultimately a 21-page freehand written response. And so think about that when we review the letter, when we review the times, writing in the margins, writing with scraps from a smuggled in piece of paper, from pleading to have a pad to be able to finish this letter on. And so we can talk about the social political context, we can talk about the religious context, we can talk about the circumstances under which he began to respond. But equally important to all of that, I want us to understand the context of the text for today, because it's universal. It is a never-ending, universal cry and hope for freedom and justice. Dr. King's life and story is the quest for civil rights, period. It is not a Black history. It is not uniquely American history. And although Dr. King was Christian, it is not a solely Christian story either. Why do you say that? Thanks for asking. Let me show you. One of the many nuances of the word dharma itself means justice, in that the sense of belief, and I'm quoting, that all people possess intrinsic value, that all are endowed with inherent dignity, and therefore should be helped to realize this dignity. O you who have believed, be persistently standing firm in justice, even if it be against yourselves or parents or relatives, whether rich or poor, Allah is more worthy of both. Quran. The Hebrew Bible tells us to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable than sacrifice. The Baha'i quote, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. I could do this all day long. I'm sure you can imagine that. But the point is that it is universal. And while we celebrate Dr. King, we also recognize our calling to the continual human quest for dignity and parity. We who fight for the abolition of injustice are already confined and bound by laws and systems that redline our rights and gerrymander our general humanity. And also bound from his cell, Dr. King was able to face his fear and find purpose. Fear, you say? I don't remember the letter speaking of fear. Well, that's why I wanted to socio-locate us so that we could be right where he was, because I think that it doesn't take too much of a stretch to understand the social climate and the emotions a person might face, having witnessed beatings, dogs sinking their teeth into unarmed, nonviolent people, and the ugly and inhumane treatment he spoke about behind the doors where people were pushed and cursed and slapped and kicked his words and refused food because they sang grace, I think we can assume the fear that might have been surrounding him and the people that were there with him. And certainly, by way of just writing, we understand that he was able to find the purpose. So my point is, just as it was for Dr. King, we may not have the best accommodations, but we can advocate. And even though we don't have means, we can literally work in the margins. There's a song, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." And that's the happy that I was alluding to earlier, because we can find our purpose even in the scraps until we can see the light, those bars are removed and those doors are opened. I mentioned that Dr. King was born in 1929, and so was Anne Frank. She preceded him in death in 1945. Dr. King was born in 1929, but guess who else was and is still here? Activist and music pioneer Berry Gordy, Japanese-American contemporary artist Yayoi Kusama, architect Frank Gehry, activist, artists, architects, then still here. You know who else wasn't born in 1929 but is still here? You, us. You are here. You are the living history of today and tomorrow. And our happy is that we do not labor alone. Individually and collectively, we each are that inner spiritual church that Dr. King talked about. We are the church within the church, the true ecclesia, and we are the hope of the world. And because of this, faith is restored. Faith is replenished. Faith is refillable. So perhaps once again, I have become too optimistic means once again, that means I'm continually seeking and again and again. And optimism is refillable, replenished, restored. Anne Frank said, I don't think of all the misery, but of the beauty, but of the beauty that still remains. It is that beauty that allows us to once again be optimistic, to once again and again and again seek justice for the neighbor. Like Dr. King, we too can no longer have despair about the future and no fear about the outcome of our struggle. We are once again optimistic, knowing we will not fail. Thank you.